Go ahead.
I guess a question for John. How, if the trade war or trade dispute is about stealing intellectual property, how do you resolve that? What did the Chinese agree to that would satisfy that concern?
Well, thank you. It's a great question, and I don't know that anybody has an easy answer to it. One of the challenges has been both for the U.S. negotiators and the Chinese negotiators to think through is, given what the U.S. is asking, what they're demanding, and to be sure, it's significant reform of China's, not only their intellectual property practices, but we're actually asking for changes in other ways as well. If you look at the industries we've targeted with our tariffs, we're targeting China's Made in 2025 initiative, and these are a set of their advanced manufacturing industrial sectors that they want to develop and that they want to target for growth within their country. And so the U.S. is making, in these demands and these negotiations and in our strategy, we're not only focusing on things that they're doing wrong in intellectual property, WTO obligations we think they're violating, but we're also taking our own, muscular, if you will, mercantilist approach to trying to meet them, at the negotiating table for our own long-term competitiveness in these sectors. So when you think about the political capital, the long-term decisions that the Chinese government has made to advance this industrial policy, this is a long-term economic plan for them. You think of the kinds of changes we're asking of them in their own internal legal structures. What are the sorts of deliverables they can give us in the short term that look like a deal? And they're hard to find. That is why some, I'm trying to air quotes with experts, some outside China watchers, I'm not a China hand in D.C., but that's why some China hands are beginning to speculate openly. And there was a conference a couple weeks ago in D.C. where several long-term China policy veterans were brought together. And some of them speculated that what the current administration is seeking, in a sense, is not really necessarily simply changes to China's internal policies, but in a sense a divorce, to decouple or to reduce the degree of entanglement between our economies, to lessen our interdependence on each other, and to force perhaps diversity of our own trade relationships around the world, which is a tough thing to handle in the short term because China is where much of the growth is, right? I mean, if money is fungible, if markets are in this sense open and supply is going to meet demand wherever it finds it, what is and I'm not the economist here, but what does that friction look like? How static is that? How elastic will be their market responses? So that's also one reason why there may not be really a short-term deal. And why the administration, I think Undersecretary McKinney here may have talked about this, be patient. Settle in for the long haul. What is that long term? What is that long haul? And I don't know that anybody really knows the answers. My colleagues up here may want to address part of that as well.
Well, I mean, it kind of reminds me of the old, in the long term we're all dead, and I think that's a real, that's a real concern. May come at this in a bit of a contrarian way, but the Chinese are good students of history. The Chinese have watched other economies develop. They've watched the countries that get caught in what's called the middle class trap. You look at Mexico, you look at Brazil, you look at Argentina. These are countries that began to grow by manufacturing, cheap labor, you manufacture, but you get to a point where your workers start to make too much money for you to be the cheap manufacturer. Your workers start to become consumers. And then how do you get to that next level? And the Chinese watched and they understood how countries like Japan and how countries like South Korea and countries like Singapore got to that next level. And they got to that next level by massive government intervention in the economy. You look at Japan, you remember back to the 1980s. I see quite a bit of gray hair in the room that you remember the 1980s when Japan was taking over everything. METI, the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of International Trade and Investment in Japan, really determined the banks, the same things we're accusing China of picking the winners and things. China understands that's how Japan got where they were before they reached now their stagnation. They understand that's how Korea got where they were, how they got over that middle class hump. And they also understand that that happened because at the time, the United States allowed it to happen because for us, geopolitically, it was more important for us to have Japan as a strong ally and a bulwark against the Soviet Union and against Russia, the same thing with Korea. So they understand the way that Japan got where they were, the way that Korea got where they were, was doing exactly what China is doing right now. And they also understand that we allowed Japan and Korea to do that, but now we're telling them they can't do the same thing. I'm not saying that what China is doing and intellectual property stealing and a lot of that is absolutely wrong, and that there are ways to address that. What I'm saying is that we start to look at China as not playing by the rules, but China is playing by the rules that every other country, including ourselves. I mean, we started developing by stealing the corn secrets from the UK. They understand, as students of history, that they're doing exactly what every other economy that reached that industrialized level, that got past that middle income trap. They're doing exactly what every other country did, and it's maybe a message that we don't want to hear in the United States, but I think it's one that we need to be cognizant of. And also, if we look, where does this end with China? It's also very important to understand in Chinese history their century of humiliation that started with the Opium Wars in 1848 when the British forced open, took Hong Kong, forced open the port of Shanghai, and that century of humiliation, century of stagnation in China started because they capitulated on trade to the West. And you can be sure that Xi Jinping and the Chinese understand that very well. The Chinese leadership understand that, and the Chinese people understand that very well. So I think we are really in for a long haul, and I think we need to understand each other a lot more than just hurling insults across the Pacific.
One thing I'd like to add is our contacts over in China have told us that the leader of China is probably the strongest leader they've had since Chairman Mao, and he's really dug in his heels, and he does not want to look weak or give in, and especially in exporting soybeans, what we've learned is that it's more of almost an embargo than it is just tariffs. I don't know if they'll do the same thing with hardwoods, but they definitely have done it here. But in all fairness, they've been doing it before even the trade wars. But it's even been amplified. So they basically have told these soybean importers or crushing plants, you need to be really careful when you import soybeans into China. And, at first maybe it'll be hard to get an import certificate. And then later, maybe other actions will happen.
Can I just make an observation that struck me, your comment, John, about one potential goal might be to decouple the economies. And in light of what Mike has talked about, the linkage of the hardwood economy of the United States with China, that's a pretty ominous statement.
We got another question? Can't be the only question. Come on, don't be shy. Don't make me go to my list. Oh, right here, David.
Do you think there'll be anything that comes out of the G20 summit between Trump and Xi that may be useful or helpful? I guess it didn't sound like it from the comments previously to this question, but.
Well, I don't know if you were here in the morning. I promised not to make any more predictions in my life, particularly with this administration, but because my average has gone way down. D.C. used to be a lot more predictable. I think it's obviously anything's possible when you get two heads of state together. And I think that there is a strong political desire or political motivation maybe on both sides to show a win, to show something. There's anxiety here. There's a lot of anxiety in China as well. And Xi Jinping is, did I say that right? Yeah, Xi Jinping. See, I'm used to Latin America. Surnames and first names. He is a strong leader. He's dug in his heels, and he's got a lot of political capital behind this, but he has to take care of his own politics as well. So there may be headlines. There may be things that look like deliverables, but nothing in the way of a significant development. I just don't can't see what that looks like. We've got too much on the table. There's been too much blood spent right now for them just to walk out of the trenches and have a Christmas peace accord. And I think for long term, I think for our president, I don't think he sees that as his political win. I think this is there's a lot of fuel in this for him for the next 4 to 6 years. I mean, just looking at it from a purely political standpoint. But I would say that, you know, when it comes to interpreting this administration, sort of what the president really cares about, you do this with every administration. What are their top 3 priorities? Where are they going to pick their battles? I think for this president, this is where his ideology and his politics are most closely, this is where they're most accord. I think this is how I think this strategy is in accord with how he sees the world, how he sees the U.S.'s long-term economic interests. I don't think he's going to abandon that. So I think for there to be a real breakthrough, I think it means that Xi Jinping has given up a lot in November. So is he ready to do that? You know, I don't know, but I don't see that. I see that the next level in this battle gets tougher. I think we start seeing non-tariff actions.
One thing I would mention is that if you look at the forward contracts in the futures market, you see fairly high prices, in my opinion. It tells us that the market, or a lot of people in the market, haven't come to grips with the idea that this will go on for a long period of time. So for people in the audience, I don't know what the hardwood prices are in the future, like next December, but you might want to take a hard look at those prices and ask yourself, do you want to just go through it completely uncovered?
Could you expand on what you mean by non-tariff actions?
So I think earlier Mr. Snow was describing the use of phytosanitary certificates to block the import of products that are at port but landing them at the dock. China has done this a lot. They have opaque administration of what we call tariff rate quotas, where you technically have access, or on paper you have access, but actually getting the import license to bring the specific shipment in and getting it into the market is hard to do. There are a lot of things they can do at ports, interior, just to block the way. It's sort of like that old Japanese inspection of your fruits and vegetables sitting on the dock waiting 30 days for the inspection, and in the meantime they go bad. Those are non-tariff barriers, and that's actually the hardest part of international trade is not reducing tariffs. It's getting a lot more legal consistency and better enforcement on the SPS side.
And we call it, non-tariff barriers, but not all of the weapons in the Chinese arsenal have to do with trade. We can't match them one for what we ship as opposed to what they ship, but they have a lot of other tools. We just saw last week that Starbucks had 5 permits to open new Starbucks stores that have been put on hold in China. So this isn't a direct export, but here it is a U.S. company trying to expand and running into difficulties. So, we tend to focus on the trade issues and, we ship, they ship more to us than we ship to them, so, they've got more to lose, so they're going to back down. There's a lot of other things, Buick automobiles and, that we manufacture in China. There's a lot of things they can do to make it difficult for Buick to compete with Chery and with the Chinese manufacturers in China. So it's not just a question of tariffs and what's coming in and out of borders. There's a lot of things that can be done beyond that, again, to inflict damage, political and economic damage on the U.S. and vice versa. The 350,000 Chinese students studying in U.S. universities, for example, if they start to pull out or they start to not allowing their students come over, a lot of American universities are pretty heavily dependent on full paying foreign students. So there's, again, we can't just focus on actual goods and services crossing borders. There's a lot of other tools in the box that can disrupt trade and disrupt the economics of both countries.
Just to put a coat on that as well, I think it's worth noting that part of the 301 that the U.S. is going after China with, we've talked about the tariffs. A big part of this has been the investment restrictions that the administration is putting on Chinese investment in the United States. So Chinese, behavior on U.S. investment in China is obviously an area where they've already been problematic, but there's a lot more they can do. And remember that a big part of our trade is outside goods. It's in services and it's in other areas. And he mentions the movement of persons and so forth. There's just a lot of ways they can go.
another question for Mike. I guess the easy answer for replacing the Chinese market is the next China be the United States with such a big domestic economy. And we used to use all that wood. I guess the harder part is how you accomplish that. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I think it's a shame that when we start looking at, at the hardwood industry in the United States, and I understand it's a lot of small companies, it's very fragmented, but the fact that we do absolutely no promotion in the United States other than advertising to each other through trade magazines. We do literally no promotion to architects and designers. We do no promotion to the public about why they should be using solid wood instead of using plastics, which are recyclable. So plastics are great. Let's use plastic. We're not fighting that battle. As you said, the only market that can replace China is the U.S. And we have the wood basket right here. And the most frustrating thing is we're doing nothing about it. We're doing absolutely nothing about it. We're talking about, the Chinese, this is horrible, this is that, but we're doing absolutely nothing to develop our own market. And from my point of view, that's inexcusable.
All right, we're having a discussion, obviously, with, the main discussion with China and how where this leverage is going. We talked earlier, there was a talk earlier about the soybean markets and how, obviously, Brazil is going to try and flood, going to try and produce heavy and make their money trying to recoup. Do we see a lot of activity from the administration trying to leverage with our allies around the world back onto China to, kind of bring this around through backdoor diplomacy?
With Brazil and China, you have a unique situation. There's just absolutely no way China's economy could have grown the way it has without the existence of the United States, Brazil, Argentina, and Australia, quite frankly. So if you look at their steel industry, which is one of their major industries, they import the vast majority of their iron ore from basically Brazil and Australia. So the likelihood of us being able to put any pressure on Brazil relative to China is very slim. In fact, they actually have somewhat of an advantage in the fact that they are their biggest customer for many of their industries, mainly their mining industry and their agriculture industry.
Just to add to that, and maybe a slightly different way of approaching it. I think you're right about Brazil. Obviously, some of the largest developing countries have. For us to be seeding some of that market, they're the ones who are going to take it. And not just Brazil, obviously Argentina, others in the region, Australia and agriculture, so forth. Soybeans hits hard because we've been so dependent as soybean exporters on the Chinese market. But this touches on, I think I mentioned earlier that at least in Washington and among a lot of the pro-trade side of town, they don't quibble with the topic. They don't quibble with going after China on IP violations, forced tech transfer, and they don't even go after quibble with going after them on investment restrictions because all the rules requiring joint, local partners and all that. But what they quibble with is the tactic, is the strategy, and this gets to the strategy part of it. U.S. is not alone in having problems with what's going on in China, right? So does much of the rest of the developed world, certainly the EU, certainly Japan, Korea. That's their neighborhood, right? The reason that these other countries are so interested in doing a TPP with us, the reason Japan wanted the opportunity to enter into a free trade arrangement with us without having to do it bilaterally. Politically, they could do it plurilaterally. With others at the table, it was harder for them politically to do it bilaterally. The reason they want to do this is because they're all dealing with China. And so when they quibble with the strategy, what they were hoping is that when the U.S. takes this on, they did so marshaling all the support of our allies around the world to train all of our fire together in one direction, rather than trying to do it alone, in the meantime training our other fire at those countries as well with steel and aluminum. Right? So we've opened a war on two fronts, and rather than taking these allies and using them to help us. Right? And other countries have asked to do that. I mean, that's the reason the EC president was over here in part was, please don't do a 232 on autos. And by the way, we don't really understand why you're doing this on steel and aluminum. We're all taking, the suck, so to speak, on the global overcapacity. Let's work together. And so that's what they talk about, the strategy. Will that happen? I don't know that we're seeing it yet. I think as soon as if the 232 in autos has the potential to blow all of this out of the water, if we can get past the 232 on steel and aluminum and find a way to bring them back to the table, these other countries to work together, I think we can kind of start to turn that corner. But we're fighting with one arm, basically. The other arm are our allies.
Couldn't have said it better. That's exactly the point where we should be working with Canada, with Europe, with that to address these issues with China because they have the exact same issues. And by at the same time picking fights with our natural allies to go into China, again, for me, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. If we wanted to deal with that, let's deal with China with all of our allies together, and then do things incrementally. But it seems to me reckless to open trade war fronts on all sides when we need allies essentially to address China because they are working very hard right now to produce their own allies, and they're spending a lot of money on foreign aid and trying to the Belt and Road. They're doing their best to try to bring as many allies as they can, and I think unfortunately we're making it easier for them to do that.
I'm sorry to do this. I'm going to add another coda onto my coda upon the coda. Once the topic gets going, earlier I also was talking about WTO reform, and this is like, what is the role in the WTO of all this? If I had paced myself better, I had a great flowery discussion about that already. The WTO is this multilateral forum that we helped create 70 years ago, and we have assumed leadership, and other countries expect leadership out of us in Geneva to write these rules. Part of for us has been we live by these rules anyway. Right? We already have a legal culture where due process, sanctity of contract, these things we take for granted. In other countries, that's not the case. We take for granted that we're a very uncorrupt country. We may joke about it, but we actually have very low levels of corruption in our country relative to even other developed countries. We take these things for granted, and one of the purposes of the GATT system, one of them, not the only one, but one of them, has been to help other countries start to live by our rules, because it's in our benefit that they do. We're going to do it anyway. We want them to do it as well. So we've always been that leader there in Geneva. In addition to training our tariff-fire on steel and aluminum against some of our own allies, we're also abandoning the field, if you will, and maybe that's a pejorative way of saying it, but we are attacking the WTO itself, the very institution that has been the forum where these global rules get set and where other countries have been doing much, much better over the decades and getting there. Most of them want to get there as well. As we attack the dispute settlement arm of the WTO, as we start to cede our leadership role on the negotiating side, last December we had the most recent biennial ministerial, all the trade ministers around the world come together in Buenos Aires. And for the first time since creation of the WTO, the U.S. did not help draft and forge agreement on a consensus document about what the next 2 years will look like in the negotiating side of the WTO. We stood back and we said no, because the WTO is not working for us right now. Bob Lighthizer actually left a day early for the ministerial to send that signal. China has tried to take the opportunity to step in and say, we believe in the multilateral trading system. We will help lead, and they are the fastest growing economy. They're now the second largest, and 2040 or whatever, they will be the largest. Other countries have to care about China too. They want help taking on China, but they can't ignore China. We might be able to withdraw to somewhat and look for other partners, but it's harder for the rest of the world. So, bringing those allies together and doing it through the WTO, I think, is a strategy that a lot of people expected us to take. And so finding our way back to those, kind of getting the rubber back on the asphalt, I think that those are the two places to look.
So kind of along those same lines, we're talking about the introduction of all this protectionism that we're seeing coming out of the administration, which is spilling over into everything that you're talking about. So one, where do you think we are in that cycle of starting to introduce more protectionism? Is that going to be more contagion? Is this just the beginning, or do we actually have the possibility of stopping it now if we kind of right the ship? And then ultimately, as our world leader economy, as you said, is this going to slow that down, prolong that, add to stability, or actually push us back the other direction?
I'm already doing a lot of talking, and my colleagues may want to take a shot at this one. Okay, well, I'll start off and then I'll hand it off. All of you who saw Ferris Bueller's Day Off, remember the economics teacher talking about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, right, from 1930. And that was a statute that the U.S. passed, the Congress enacted, that raised tariff walls across the board. And it was in response, of course, to the Great Depression. And instead of helping give some space for U.S. Manufacturers to find their footing and become more competitive, it exacerbated and played a large role. I'm a lawyer, not an economist. Played a large role, obviously, in taking one economic crisis into a conflagration. Right. We have a very different economy now, 80 years later, 90 years later, but protectionism is contagious, right? So when one country raises tariffs, another country will respond in kind in some way. If that country doesn't have the same resources to raise tariffs as effectively, they'll look for some other way. This is power relations. This is power politics. And one of the successes of the Bretton Woods system has been to reduce that temptation, to bring things into a common set of rules. So one of the we talked about non-tariff barriers in the WTO. That's sort of has been the challenge for the last 10, 15 years in the WTO, and that's where a lot of people want to sort of train some of our thinking. One of the successes, the reason we're at that point, is in the WTO system, is that we were able to get everybody to agree to a balanced set of tariffs, above which they will not raise their rates. All right, and so in our entire HTS code, our harmonized tariff schedule, all those tariffs are our bound rates by and large. Our rates are at our bound level, but lots of countries have rates lower than their bound rates. Their applied rates are lower, but they could go up. But that's been a success of the WTO. This is where we are. And the next challenge has been to get those big developing countries to bring their tariff peaks down to where you see them in the developed world. It's a challenge for them because they're a lot more vulnerable internally than we are. Also, a lot of these countries don't have the same legal structures. They don't have an income tax like we do. The poorest countries rely on tariffs just for simple revenue, government revenue, right? We have India has really high tariffs. They face all kinds of internal problems, but they're working through. If the leader of this process, the leader of this global system, starts to raise tariffs above our rates, I mentioned those disputes. We're getting challenged in the WTO for the way we've raised our tariffs. We're the ones that other countries think are breaking the rules that we helped write. It makes it a lot harder for us to go to them and say, hey, don't do this. And I'll leave you this, and then I'm going to turn this microphone over. The biggest danger I see, I do a lot of agriculture trade. That's sort of a main area of my practice. And one of the things I'm most concerned about, when we use this national security justification to raise tariffs on other countries, steel and aluminum, these aren't guns, right? We're not talking about things that our soldiers need. These are steel and aluminum we want for our manufacturing base. And now we're going to do it to cars. If we're going to use a national security justification to raise tariffs on those imports, why can't every other country do the same thing to say, food security is a national security priority for my country? I need to make sure that I can produce a domestic food supply. So if you're going to do it on steel and aluminum, I can do it on food. And we are a net exporter of agriculture products. That's the danger. That's what the door we open up.
Just to answer your question directly, we think it's going to get a lot tougher and a lot worse, or a lot more intense before it gets better. You have two leaders that are not willing to back down. There is some ego involved, we feel like. Now, on agriculture, for better or worse, every other country does, keep food out for the name of national security. That's why China doesn't import as much corn like they do soybeans. But anyway, so we're in that situation, and we think it's going to it's just going to be a really tough road, and that it's not going to get resolved magically like a lot of people. It seems like a lot of people in the market just have an opinion that at some point they're all going to get together, talk to each other for one day, and then it's just all going to go away. We just don't share that opinion.
All right, I think that's going to wrap us up for the panel. Let's thank our panelists again for joining us.